Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Pearson. I'm the Environmental Services Manager for the City of Hayward. And I'm going to start things off with, I'm going to start the presentation. And let's see. Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Eric Pearson. I am the Environmental Services Manager for the City of Hayward. And just so everybody knows, we are recording this meeting. So we'll be making it available to people who couldn't make this time. Also, before we get started, I have a brief statement to read. So we welcome your comments and we request that speakers present their remarks in a respectful manner within the established time limits and focus on issues which directly affect the city or are within the jurisdiction of the city. Speakers shall not use threatening, profane, or abusive language, which disrupts, disturbs, or otherwise impedes the orderly conduct of this meeting. The city is committed to maintaining a workplace free of unlawful harassment, and we have city staff attending this meeting. Discriminatory statements or conduct that is hostile, intimidating, oppressive, or abusive are per se disruptive to a meeting and will not be tolerated. All right, thank you. So to start off, we're going to introduce the team that we have here from the city, as well as our consultant team that is helping out. So with the city staff, we have Leah Schmidt, our principal planner, Nicole Grecki, our sustainability specialist, and McKenna Colucci, our sustainability and climate action fellow. And then Rincon Consultants is our consultant team helping with the project. And we have 3 people here from the Rincon team joining us today. They are Kelsey Bennett, Erica Leonard, and Lauren Collar. So today we're going to be presenting to you the draft climate action plan. That will include the background and purpose, how we got to where we are today, including previous public meetings. We will review the measures, which are specific goals for reducing emissions in certain categories. And then we'll go to next steps, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So the Climate Action Plan is part of Hayward's general plan, and it was updated along with 3 other sections or elements of the general plan. All 4 sections were started together, and in the earlier phases, we combined our community outreach to cover all 4 of them. So the other 3 sections are the housing element, which was adopted by the City Council in February this year, and then certified by the state in July. And then we have also the hazards element, which we have a draft available for review. It includes new policies and programs to address seismic and geologic hazards, flood hazards, rising sea levels, wildfire, and evacuation capacity. And then finally, we also have a new environmental justice element that is also out for review. It includes policies and programs that address pollution burden, public facilities, food access, safe and sanitary homes, physical activity and health, and civic engagement. So while the focus of today's meeting is on the Climate Action Plan, we are also happy to take any questions or comments on the hazards and environmental justice elements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey.
Thanks, Eric. Good evening. My name is Kelsey Bennett. I'm an environmental and sustainability planning director with Rincon Consultants, who was hired by the city to help them prepare the climate action plan. Before we get into the draft climate action plan, or the CAP for short, throughout tonight's presentation itself, first wanted to give some background context regarding what climate change is and what its impacts are. So for this figure, Earth's climate is mostly driven by energy that comes from the sun. And when solar radiation reaches Earth's atmosphere, some of it is reflected back into space and some of it is absorbed by Earth's surface. And so as Earth absorbs that solar radiation, it the surface heats back up and re-radiates heat back out into the atmosphere. And while some of that heat escapes past the atmosphere into space, gases in the atmosphere prevent the loss of some of the heat, and that gases trapping the heat are known as greenhouse gases, or GHGs for short. And without some GHGs in the atmosphere, the Earth will not be warm enough to sustain life as we know it. So this heat trapping quality of GHGs in Earth's atmosphere is known as the greenhouse gas effect. And increased levels of specific GHGs in the atmosphere means that less heat escapes to space, and more trapped heat in the atmosphere leads to hotter than average global temperatures, which is colloquially known as global warming. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. So global warming then in turn leads to climate change, and that can include extreme heat events, longer periods of drought, and more intense storms. And the various adverse impacts of climate change include anything from increased risk of wildfire, worsened air quality and human health, property damage, potential, and higher energy costs. And although many changes to climate are indeed governed by natural processes, human activities have added GHGs to the atmosphere at a rate that is unprecedented in Earth's history and are therefore accelerating climate change. Next slide, please. So what is a CAP and its purpose? At its core, a CAP is a plan for reducing GHG emissions and improving quality of life for residents. So overall, as GHG levels continue to increase and threaten our health and safety, CAPs are becoming more important than ever. Our state law, specifically California Senate Bill 32 and Assembly Bill 1279, requires every jurisdiction to reduce its fair share of GHG emissions and to meet state emission goals. So after accounting for state and regional laws and programs that reduce emissions on a larger scale, for example, things like increased vehicle fuel economy standards and more energy efficient new development, the remaining amount of GHG reductions needed to achieve Hayward's fair share of emissions reductions guides the extent of the local actions it needs to take to meet the targets and are the primary content of the CAP itself. The Hayward CAP establishes effective, community-driven, and feasible actions to meet state emission goals for 2030, and also to show progress to meet the state's ultimate goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. And with the co-benefits of things like lower energy costs, reduced air pollution, and supported economic development, the reduction of GHGs also helps to improve the quality of life for residents in the community. Next slide. And then let's go over what the CAP planning steps are. To give an overview, the city first started with preparing an updated baseline inventory of community GHG emissions for the year 2019. Community GHG emissions refers to emissions that occur within the community of Hayward, and also that's something that the community and the city have effect over, can help affect and impact. And then future emissions were forecasted based on current and proposed land uses, operations, and the population in the community, and the projected population in the community. And then the city determined the GHG emission targets for upcoming years, including, but not limited to, the next state required year of 2030. And then based on that delta that's needed to reduce the forecasted emissions to the target levels, GHG reduction measures were identified, quantified, and included in the draft CAP for various emission sectors. And then funding is identified, and the measures and the actions are implemented by the determined sectors and timelines. And then finally, the city will continue to monitor and track community GHG emissions and the progress related to implementation of the CAP. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole to discuss Hayward's GHG emission sources that are addressed by the CAP.
Thank you, Kelsey. So on the screen, we have a pie chart of our greenhouse gas emissions by source. As you can see, the majority of our emissions come from on-road transportation, over 60% of our emissions. The majority of these emissions come from cars, as our public transportation emissions are less than 1% of that 62% total. Our second largest source of emissions is natural gas in buildings. So everything from your gas space heater, gas stove, to also this includes commercial and industrial uses as well. As you'll see in our draft climate action plan, many of the proposed measures and actions are focused on reducing emissions related to transportation and natural gas in buildings, although we cover all the sectors. So this graph shows the per capita greenhouse gas targets and per capita forecast. You can look at it in more detail in our CAP executive summary, but just to go over it briefly, the gray line shown is our business as usual forecast. So this was if we were to do nothing, the state were to do nothing, our projected emissions. The black line right below that is the adjusted forecast. So this accounts for any state level legislation, policies, and programs, but no city level ones. The green line is the council adopted targets. So those have the marks that are 2030. You'll see is what our council adopted goal is, as well as you'll see it zeroes out at 2045, where we have a carbon neutrality goal. The yellow dashed line is our estimated forecast based on the draft measures and actions that are outlined in the CAP. You'll see where that yellow dashed line and green line meet. That's at 2030, where we meet our goal based on implementing our CAP. And as you can also see, if you follow out that dashed yellow line, it puts us on a pathway to carbon neutrality, but doesn't quite meet that target. But this CAP will put us on a pathway that the city can then reevaluate it once we've met that 2030 goal. As we mentioned earlier, we began this process at the end of 2021, and we've held 2 public workshops like this one in 2022. In our first workshop in April, we asked some general questions relating to what barriers there are for residents to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what areas or sectors residents would like to see greenhouse gas emissions in, and potential ways that we can achieve that. What we heard was that the largest barrier identified to reducing emissions was equity. To address this, we have created equity guardrails and included equity actions throughout the CAP. In total, we have 29 CAP actions that were created to make sure an equity lens was being applied to all the different programs and policies. Workshop number 2 took place in July of 2022, and staff introduced draft measures and actions at this workshop. Feedback from this workshop was taken and directly implemented into our draft that's now been published, including actions that aim to study and identify where to place safe bike lanes, help residents make the switch to electric appliances, and conduct thoughtful and equitable community outreach to ensure that all community members in Hayward are represented and have a voice in the decision-making process. In addition to the workshops, we hosted focus groups, we did tabling, we had surveys, we worked with Chabot College to do interviews with residents and presented to our Council Sustainability Committee, our Planning Commission, and City Council for feedback. I wanted to highlight one example of how the draft actions have changed based on our community engagement. So on the screen on the left, we see an original action in one of the first versions of our CAP. And that was to work with e-scooter or e-bike companies to bring docked e-bike share or e-scooter share to Hayward. We heard from senior communities that the e-scooter and e-bike hubs can pose a safety hazard for them, especially when people don't properly dock them and leave them in the middle of sidewalks, making it hard to impossible to get around them, especially if people have mobility issues. We also heard from residents that a high priority should be providing rebates or incentives over policy requirements. So now the drafted action in our published draft CAP is to partner with community organizations and local bike shops to provide rebates for low-income community members to purchase bicycles, helmets, pumps, e-bikes, and e-scooters and other related equipment. We also saw that a high priority is tree planting. So we've added feasibility studies to identify where we can convert areas to green space or incorporate green infrastructure into projects. We've also added in energy efficiency measures. So we've really tried to take what we've heard over the past year and a half and reflect that in the draft version. Now I'm going to turn it over to McKenna to go over the measures in our draft cap.
Thank you, Nicole. So based on the community feedback Nicole just mentioned and research, we identified 5 sectors where we can reduce emissions and in the process build resilience to climate change. And these sectors are shown here. They're building energy, transportation, solid waste, water and wastewater, and carbon sequestration. Each sector has a number of measures that we will go over in a minute, and those measures are then further broken down and supported by actions. We won't be getting into all the actions today, but they can all be found in the draft cap. Next slide, please. Thanks. Moving into the building sector measures, we can see that they include a range of items, including continuing the requirement to install all electric appliances in new residential construction, electrifying existing single-family homes, electrifying or decarbonizing existing commercial and multifamily buildings, and promoting clean energy and energy efficiency improvements for Hayward residents and city facilities. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Next are our transportation sector measures. This is our largest sector in terms of emissions, so it's fitting that it also has the most measures and actions. These measures will aim to increase active transportation, which means walking and biking, improve public transit programs, disincentivize single passenger vehicles to favor more bicycle and pedestrian travel, and increase the use of zero emission vehicles by residents, businesses, the city fleet, and off-road, which refers to vehicles not used in everyday travel and includes heavy construction vehicles. Moving on to solid waste, we see efforts to enforce the new statewide Senate Bill 1383, which requires every jurisdiction to provide organic waste collection services to all residents and businesses to divert organics and food waste from landfills. Additionally, we hope to increase overall landfill diversion of waste. Next up is our water and wastewater measure, which looks to reduce and maintain lowered water use by 15%. Our final sector is carbon sequestration, which means pulling carbon from the atmosphere and placing it into a carbon sink. And that is just anything that absorbs more carbon than it releases into the atmosphere, such as oceans, rocks, or plants. We have 2 measures that will increase carbon sequestration by planting and maintaining 1,000 new trees annually, which, as Nicole mentioned, is a direct result of community feedback, and by increasing the use of compost, which increases carbon storage in soils. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Eric.
Thank you, McKenna. And so based on our estimates, these 6 measures are the ones that will result in the most greenhouse gas emission reductions. These measures also represent some of the most challenging work that we have ahead of us in terms of city resources and community participation. So these are to expand the city's current requirement for all electric construction so that it includes all new buildings, including commercial buildings. And then again, electrify existing single-family homes, electrify existing commercial and multifamily buildings, increase the use of public and shared transit, increase the use of zero emission vehicles, and then finally implement the new state law SB 1383 to keep organics out of the landfill. So the draft climate action plan, also the hazards element and environmental justice element are all available on the project webpage at this link. And we'll be taking public comments on all 3 documents through November 14th. And so for next steps here, we have, for anyone interested in the analysis that we've prepared to comply with the California Environmental Quality Act, we will have a draft initial study and negative declaration available on November 8th. Then on November 13th, we'll be presenting the 3 documents to the Council Sustainability Committee, and we'll be asking for their recommendation for the full City Council to adopt the general plan amendments. Then tentatively on December 14th, we'll be presenting all 3 to the Planning Commission. This will be a public hearing, which is necessary to amend the general plan. And again, we'll be seeking their recommendation. And then we tentatively have 2 dates in January, one for the adoption of the hazards element and environmental justice element, and then another council meeting for adoption of the climate action plan. So that concludes our presentation, and now we would like to take questions and comments. You can either click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or you can type in a question using the Q&A button. We're going to start off with a 4-minute time limit for comments. And then if we have time, we may be able to allow people to speak more than once after we hear from everybody. So, and so now we will we'll end this presentation, and I see we have a hand raised.
I'll let McKenna, once you're ready to share. We will have a timer on the screen for you just so you can keep track. Perfect. And so I am gonna allow Jesse to speak, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, good to see you all. I'm a teacher at Tennyson High School and also Community Services Commissioner for the City of Hayward. And I had a couple of questions. My first was, as we move forward with the plan that council recently had made regarding the micro transportation elements, the bikes, the e-bikes, the scooters. If there's consideration for public bike locking areas besides at, BART, for example, when I'm someone who typically rides my bike whenever I can, and often places that I go to, shopping centers, I have a hard time finding a good place to lock my bike. And I know it's not technically allowed to be locking them on street signs, for example. But often there is no safe place to lock my bike. So I'm curious if Hayward is looking towards adapting a plan to have city-owned bike locking areas. My other question was, in this presentation, if it's included, for example, the Russell City power plant and the CO2 emissions from the natural gas burned there, if that's part of the pie chart, if it's separate because it's a separate entity. I'm just kind of curious where that fits in. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Jesse. I think I can try to answer your question. So for bike locks, yes, that is something that we're bike parking storage facilities. We are thinking about that. I think it's part of our bicycle and pedestrian master plan. We're also in the process of applying for some grant funding with that would include some new parking facilities. And so, but if that grant does not pan out, I'm sure we'll be looking at other ways to get that work done. So we do recognize the need in the community. As far as the Russell City Energy Center, we do have some of our electricity. I mean, it's our emissions factor includes the renewable energy that is comes from throughout the grid that is provided to us primarily through what was East Bay Community Energy, now being called Ava Community Energy. And so some of that power does come from the Russell City Energy Center. So
and I just want to add in general that power plants are covered under cap and trade. So they're not necessarily included at like what's being produced at the power plant in the inventory.
All right. Thanks, Nicole. It's like the next hand up we have is Perseda.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, hi, I'm just a lifelong Hayward resident, and I had a couple of questions as well. I know you guys it was said that there will be 1,000 trees planted annually. I was wondering how will the city go about choosing what trees will, where the streets, will be getting these new trees. I also didn't see anything on the plan about gentrification, so I was wondering if that's being considered also in part of the climate action plan. Another question that I have was if there is a plan to clean up local creeks. For example, I live near Ward Creek and it's a complete mess. So I was wondering if there's any thoughts on that too.
All right. So I'd say with the tree species, we have a city landscape architect who helps to determine which trees get planted. A lot of those are in private development projects. Then we also have a landscape manager who maintains the city landscaped areas, and I think both of those two people on our city staff have a list of trees that they generally choose from. And I don't have that handy right now, but that's something that we're constantly looking at, and we may be revisiting as we hope to do an urban forest master plan in the next year or two, and we can take a look at tree species and where they're appropriate for different parts of the city. Gentrification, I'm not sure if we have any policies directly related to that and the documents that we're talking about. So we may need to get back to you on that one.
I would just, Eric, if you can let me add,
Yeah.
in regard to gentrification, we don't have it explicitly called out in our climate action plan. I will say on things like electrification measures, a lot of our equity lens do have us making sure that we're not necessarily causing displacement with any of those policies. So trying to make sure that people are able to stay where they live if they want to stay there in general.
Also, I might be able to jump in and say a little bit. So this project started back in 2021, and it was the climate action plan, housing element, environmental justice, and hazards element, and where there's a lot of discussion about displacement and policies and programs in order to develop housing that's affordable to all income levels and different types of housing. And then our displacement study that our housing division prepared, all of that was really explicitly discussed and included in the housing element, which went to the Planning Commission and City Council in late 2022 and early 2023. So if you're interested in that topic, go to the project website and read the housing element. There's lots of programs and policies in there on that topic.
Thanks, Leah. And then regarding the question of creek cleanups, we do have some actions identified in the climate action plan about installation of green infrastructure, which is needed to basically clean stormwater as it runs off of our developed areas and to filter that stormwater. We are separately, I don't know that it's addressed in the climate action plan, but we are working to comply with the Regional Water Quality Control Board requirements to eliminate trash from our storm drain system. So we are installing filtration devices throughout the city to try to keep the creeks clean. So. Right. Do we have
Before we go to one of the hands, I wanted to cover one of the ones that were asked in our Q&A. So the question was, I was wondering how closely you have been working with Cal State East Bay and Chabot in crafting the CAP. There are clearly going to be synergies between East Bay and Chabot's own CAP and responsibilities under state law. How are these reflected in the City of Hayward planning? So we have been working with both Chabot and CSU East Bay. Chabot actually did interviews as a part of the housing element and as a part of the climate action plan. So they were able to work with some of their professors and also do project-based learning in the classroom to have students go out and interview and get feedback for us about all the different things on these policies. And then with Cal State East Bay, we've also been working with them and some professors there, especially in regard to the environmental justice element and doing more project-based learning with some classes and professors in general. And I think, Eric, you might be able to expand on some of the other CSU East Bay things as well, and working with the sustainability team.
Right. Yes, we do participate on the CSU East Bay Campus Sustainability Committee. And so we try to coordinate our climate action plan with their campus climate action plan. And they have their meetings on a quarterly basis. And so we're continuing to meet with them regularly. So. All right, let's go to Marlena.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for this workshop or presentation. My question is how the City of Hayward can, quote unquote, address climate change when they continue to destroy the natural world in the name of, quote unquote, development, which is to develop means to destroy the natural world. So when you pave over everything, take out all the old growth and mature trees, there's no root system for the soil when you plant new trees. There's no tree canopy to sequester the carbon that the mature trees do. You can't, and renewable energy is one of the biggest lies, just like with fossil fuels. Not only is it as bad as fossil fuels, but it's even worse because you still need fossil fuels for it. And it's replacing one extractive industry with another, but it's not fully replacing it because you still need fossil fuels. To electrify, again, it interferes with the bees, the pollinators, the bird migration. If you look at what electrification actually means and if you look at how renewable energy is sourced, how it's manufactured, you literally have to mine for metals and minerals sizes of 400 feet deep minimum, football field sizes minimum. I mean, we're talking absolute destruction of the natural world in order to have so-called clean energy. There's no such thing as clean energy. You release so many carbon emissions when you source it, manufacture it, you completely contaminate the water. You contaminate the soil. And with regard to our creeks, the City of Hayward continues to remove all the trees and build on top of the creeks, when really the creeks have been identified as being just as biodiverse and important to our atmosphere and our clean air as the rainforest of the Amazon. And so my question is, how on earth can you so-called address climate change when you destroy the natural world by doing so-called development, creating the more and more energy, building infrastructure and energy, when you have to destroy the natural world to do it? You have to destroy the landscape of the natural world. So how on earth can you fight climate change doing this?
Thanks, Marlena. I think those are some good points. You know, I think when it comes to new development, there's a balance that we need to strike between accommodating, you know, population growth and housing that's needed for people that are either in the community already or may want to live in Hayward. You know, I think that by developing or increasing development in Hayward, we are preventing development from happening in other maybe more sensitive areas or areas that are needed for food production. So, you know, it's and I guess, you know, the other part of it is we are, as documented in the housing element, we are under requirements from the state to accommodate a certain amount of housing units every year, and so we need to allow for that. as far as renewable energy and clean energy, I know there's always impacts with any type of energy source, and we're I think we're on a long road to transitioning to cleaner sources, and we're just trying to minimize our impacts as we do that. So yeah, there's absolutely no silver bullet. There's no perfect solution, but we're doing our best to try to minimize our emissions and go with the cleanest options that we can find. So. All right, can we hear from Eric, please?
Sorry, Eric, you should be able to talk
Oh.
now.
Thank you. I thought I was going crazy there. Okay, so if it's okay, I have 2 questions, and the first one has to do with outreach. I've been involved, well, first of all, I'm a researcher at Cal State East Bay, and I've been involved with climate action plans in other cities for about 10 years, and I know a lot of the challenges that you all are up against, so that's why my first question is regarding outreach, because oftentimes the general public, it's just hard to, kind of reach everybody and let them know. So is there any sort of outreach plan to help get the cap out? And then I have a second question regarding sequestration.
Why don't you go ahead and ask both questions, and then we can go ahead and.
Okay. So, so with sequestration, the more that I learn, the more concerned that I get, because it kind of sounds good as sort of an experiment to try. But the nature-based solution market, because a lot of carbon credits out there are being formulated right now, I'm kind of surprised to learn that with some of the sequestration, you can get into a contract where it only sequesters the carbon for like a 40-year lease. And then after that 40 years, the people who bought the credits are no longer responsible. So I don't know if there's any sort of like a permanence model or factor that you guys include in your calculations, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Well, I'd say for outreach, we as was noted during the presentation, there's a lot of different things that we've done over the last couple of years to try to reach out to people and collect input for these different general plan amendments and the climate action plan. At this point in the process, we are focusing more on some of our more I guess official meetings with our city council and our planning commission. But I think that once the plan is adopted, we'll kind of move into another phase of outreach as we implement these projects. I'd say for sequestration, I think that we still have a lot of work to do to determine how we're going to account for all of the carbon sequestration. I think at this point, like, we're going to focus on tree planting, maintaining our marshes on the edge of the bay. And as far as any kind of carbon markets go, I think that's something that we have yet to get into. And I think it may be something that we need to explore after we, make exhaust all of our efforts on reducing emissions locally. So.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that, as Eric mentioned, it's trees and compost adding, and then our calculations for the quantification is assuming a 20-year lifespan, and that existing trees would be maintained. So, and as Eric mentioned, not purchasing any carbon offsets. I know that has been in the news a lot lately, and how those aren't always saying what they are doing. So our plan does not include any of those. And as for outreach, we're also open to other ways that we can reach more people in the community. We've tried to build relationships over the years with community members and kind of posting on the normal city channels, as well as, you know, tabling at the downtown street parties, or I went and did a presentation at a church group to let people know. So we've tried to cover as much as we can with our small team, but we're also always open. If you have another group that isn't aware that you think would be interested, connecting with our city staff so we can make a presentation if that's of interest, or making a flyer, or if we need to translate a flyer into a different language and whatnot. Those are all things we're open, and we are also relying a little bit on the community to help tell us where we're missing.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, you too.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Melissa.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Nicole. Melissa Milliman here with Keep Hayward Clean and Green. First, I just have to say thank you so much for holding these public meetings, and my ultimate respect for all the work that you guys have done on this, on the CAP, and that I'm just really so excited that Hayward is working on this kind of stuff and supporting it in so many different ways. That being said, I am wondering, and to me, this would sort of fall under the issue of course, greenhouse gases in relation to transportation, and then also the environmental justice component. And I'm going to speak basically about some personal experience here, but I am very, very concerned and wondering if the CAP is that if there's any portion of it that is addressing the greenhouse gas emissions from our airport. I live very close to the airport at the end where all of the jets and the planes take off. And I am just speaking from personal experience, and I have lots of anecdotal evidence that it is very much a problem with the fumes from the airport filtering into the neighborhoods surrounding that end of the airport. And, you know, those neighborhoods are, I would say, a good portion BIPOC minority neighborhoods. And so that's, to me, the environmental justice factor. But I'm going to give an example. I was just out a couple weeks ago working in my backyard all afternoon, and one jet after another. I would invite any of you to come over and stand in my backyard, and you're literally breathing jet fuel for hours on end. People around there, they open their doors and windows for quote unquote fresh air, and you've got a jet that's going off, and 2 minutes later you have to run around and slam everything shut. Those in the areas that are most affected, they're older homes with maybe not the greatest ceiling, and older homes where that kind of invasive fuel is getting into their homes, and we're breathing it. I mean, obviously there's noise issues from the airport, but that noise is not going to kill you or take years off your life, so it's very concerning health factor. And I know that I've done a little bit of my homework, and I understand the airport brings in a lot of money for our city, which is great. But there's got to be a solution to this problem for these neighborhoods. I know that, other cities are facing the same problem and I've talked with people at Air Quality Management about the same issue. So I'm just hoping that Hayward, if it's not in the CAP now, I hope that we're going to look at this problem. So thank you for hearing me out. Yeah,
thank you, Melissa. I know this is something that it's an issue that our airport staff is definitely aware of. As you mentioned, I mean, it is an important city asset and one that we work hard to maintain. I do know we've talked recently with our airport staff about some emissions, and I understand that any kind of, fuels are getting cleaner, but anytime we switch to a cleaner fuel option, it requires approval by the FAA. So it's a slow process. And yeah, I'm not sure I can offer much more than that, but it's definitely an issue that we're aware of. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Eric, before we jump to Jesse, can we go to some of the ones in the Q&A? So I want to bring up the one that, is there intent to make adjustments to the Hayward Loop to make it a safer path to travel using micro mobility like e-bikes, scooters, etc.?
Well, we just found out on, I think it was Thursday or Friday last week, that the city was awarded a grant to make some safety improvements to the city circulation system. And so a reevaluation of the loop is one of the projects that's going to be addressed with that grant. So I don't know exactly what the timing is, but I do know that that's coming.
And then I'm gonna read a few more. So this isn't related to GHG emissions, but are there any plans to make the city more drought resilient? And are there preparations being made for extreme rainfall and flooding?
I guess first on drought resilience, I would say that we have been doing a lot of work in partnership with East Bay Mud, because we share groundwater with East Bay Mud. And so we're making sure that we have a sustainable source of groundwater that we actually do not use on a normal basis, but we do have emergency wells that we can draw upon to use that groundwater. But other than that, we're always promoting conservation. We have a new water metering program that it uses electronic meters, and we have a new customer portal where people can more carefully and more immediately review their water usage and try to minimize the use. So, but we do have Hayward is one of the lowest per capita water use agencies in California. And so it's difficult for us to further reduce water use given how efficient we generally as a city we are. But it's something that is always that we're always striving to do better.
And then I'll just jump in really quickly and talk about flooding. Those issues, as well as like sea level rise and sort of dealing with the climate change impacts related to increased water and flooding, I think was part of the question. It disappeared. We do have policies and programs included in the safety element to deal with that, because that is considered a hazard, whereas the cap is more on the side of reducing water usage and being more efficient. The hazards element does address policies and programs and ensuring that development isn't occurring in areas that are flood prone.
Thanks, Leah. I'm going to ask one more in the Q&A before we get to you, Jesse. So a number of residents are replacing their lawns with synthetic turf. How would this material be recycled when it eventually breaks down? Since trees help sequester carbon, why don't we increase tree planting exponentially? If the city wants to make our streets more pedestrian friendly, replacing missing street trees immediately would help, since they shade paths and cause drivers to reduce their speed, which will make walking more enjoyable. I will add that the climate action plan doesn't have any actions specifically related to synthetic turf, but you are not the first person that we've heard this feedback from since we've released the public draft version of the climate action plan. So we'll definitely include this as we take this to council and the other governing bodies. I don't know, Eric, if you would like to add.
Yeah, I'd say, you know, we always encourage native planting when we can, especially over artificial turf. As far as tree planting, we are fairly aggressive with tree planting, and we know that there's much more that needs to be done. We are working with our maintenance services team that has limited crews that maintain the trees, and that's a big focus right now, is just making sure that we have the capacity to maintain any trees that we add to our urban forest. So we do have some recent grant funding that's going to allow us to pursue this further, and we're hoping to get additional grant funding that we can put together an urban forest master plan and figure out, you know, maybe be more strategic with where these where we can plant additional trees. So.
Okay, perfect. I
right.
will. Jesse, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I actually don't mind if there's anybody that hasn't spoke yet, or if they wanted to go first. I know I got a chance to speak already. So is that if I'm
looks
next?
like yeah, you're the only one with a hand raised. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I actually have two questions. The first was I had met with one of our council members this weekend, and they had mentioned that the restoration at the shoreline was going to be very, very expensive. And I don't know if it was an exaggeration, but I heard the number $1 billion, and I hope that's an exaggeration. But if not, are we looking into perhaps getting grant funding, especially when I think about the Silicon Valley businesses that are certainly able to afford this sort of thing more than we could, and still within our region? And the second question that I have, and maybe this is more directed towards HARD than the city, but although I hope there's a partnership there, is there are very few areas in Hayward that you can map the existence of trees dating back many years. If you look at the Hayward Historiscope on the website, you could see pictures of Hayward from 1954. And one of these areas is Sorensdale Park, where you could see mature trees existing as far back as 1954 that are still there today. And I'm interested if Hayward is looking into perhaps declaring areas as like sanctuary areas that cannot be, you know, it is required we keep these trees. They must stay, they must be maintained. You know, some way of preserving what little we have left, dating back, you know, since way before I was born. But yes, thank you. Those are my two questions.
All right. Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so first on the shoreline projects and preparing for sea level rise, we do have a shoreline adaptation master plan that was adopted a couple of years ago, and unfortunately, it's not an exaggeration. It is estimated at roughly $1 billion to build all the projects that were identified in the plan. Those are some rough estimates, but it's and we are pursuing grant funding to build those projects, and we've got about, I think it's about 4 or 5 projects that are already underway. In fact, we provided an update to our city council sustainability committee in June, and so we do have a report that kind of documents some of the projects that are in process. But we are working with our partners at the Hayward Area Shoreline Planning Agency, which includes the city, the East Bay Regional Park District, and HARD. And together, we're working on actually expanding HASPA to add more agency partners. And then together we're all pursuing grant funding and working on those projects. But it is a huge undertaking. So as far as trees, I'm not aware of any conversations about declaring any kind of sanctuary areas, but I know one of the grants that we recently did receive is going to be for an inventory of trees that are on public properties, and so I believe that may include HARD properties. or those that are managed by HARD. And so I think that, that inventory of publicly owned trees is going to include the data I think that you're talking about in terms of the age of the trees, and hopefully that can be used to help inform, best management practices. Right. Do we have any other questions? And I just want to say all of the comments and questions that we are hearing tonight, we will be summarizing them and sharing them with the City Council Sustainability Committee in a couple of weeks. And then we will also be sharing all of the public comments received with the Planning Commission when we present to them as well. And then ultimately to the City Council as well. All right, I want to thank everybody again for joining us tonight. We can stay on for just a few more minutes. It's just if anybody has any more questions. Yes, Melissa.
Thanks. Well, just kind of on a more informal note, back to the airport. I know where we could plant a lot of trees, and I'm obviously, I think I'm aware of the maintenance issue for new trees. I mean, it is a significant issue for planting more trees. I mean, not suggesting we don't plant more trees, but yeah, we got to figure out how to maintain the new ones we plant properly in the city. What's the point of planting trees when they're just going to die? But as you had said, Eric, that, with the issue of the airport fuel, that, there's cleaner, I know there's research about cleaner airplane fuel, and that's going to be, take some significant time. So I'm just thinking, and this would go for any airport, what about planting some trees? The corner of Hesperian and Winton, there's a huge corner there that has the Hayward Executive Airport sign, and I see guys out there weed whacking, just weeds all the time. It's a big open expanse of land on that corner. How about planting a bunch of trees there that would help absorb some of that jet fuel? And I can imagine there's possibly, height restrictions because of, smaller planes landing, and they have lower elevation flight patterns. I'm sure that would take some planning and thought. But again, I'm just thinking there's got to be a solution. There's got to be something that could help with that pretty toxic issue. So I will now, I've said my piece. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah.
Just some ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. I do want to say that we are working with a consultant to update our tree preservation ordinance, and it's kind of a side project for this same consultant. They are going to be preparing landscaping guidelines for our airport area, and so that will include trees surrounding the airport. And yeah, there are definitely some height limits that we need to worry about, and so I'm not sure about the exact heights that we can that are what the maximums are, but we could potentially take a look at what types of trees would be appropriate in that area.
And Melissa, we can put you in touch with the project manager for that project, because I know that they're doing their outreach right now. They just kicked it off, and they've been sort of going to like trunk or treat and other kind of public meetings. And so, we can put you in touch with them, and then you can give feedback through that process that Eric just talked about.
Oh, thank you, Leah. That would be absolutely wonderful. I mean, obviously I'm already on the task force, but I would be happy. I mean, I would like to be helpful in that area, you know, not just complain about it, but, you know, be helpful. So that would be
Absolutely.
really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Have a very good evening.